Friends and travelers, however you've arrived, I bid you welcome. Here at Let's Be Frank, we're about lives, and above all, living well. But I don't suppose a podcast hosted by Benjamin Franklin could be about anything else. In my lifetime, I pursued the practice of moral improvement like a science, recording my successes, and yes, oftentimes reveling in my failings. It's my hope, with our weekly almanac, to deliver to a curious world delicious morsels of history in quick, easy to digest installments, perfect for a sit in your favorite chair or a morning walk to work. At the end of each installment, I like to wrap it up in a neat little lesson you can apply to your own life, taken from the events, stories, and personalities shared in each episode. So sit back, relax, and together, let's make history. Greetings and salutations, dear listener. Welcome to another installment of Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind, with me, your faithful friend and host, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, printer. Follow B. Franklin Live across our various social media platforms on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Like us on Facebook at Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind. And if you wish to support the history we try to make every day, consider becoming a patron on our Patreon. You can find the link in our show notes. Oh, my beloved Junto, it has been quite the historic week for your favorite fake founding father. This Monday, my friends and I at Primary Source Media got together for our first ever YouTube Live to talk about the first episode of Franklin. Have you watched the Apple Plus series yet? I'm anxious to get your thoughts about it. Every Monday, we'll be getting together to share our thoughts on the most recent episode, to have a detailed discussion about not only our observations, but also the history around it. You'll have to be patient with me, as it was several hundred years ago, and my memory's not what it was. But I've particularly enjoyed their interpretation of this fascinating moment of history, where war is fought not on the battlefield, but rather instead in the courts, where the weapons are not musket and cannon, but instead fans, wigs, and intrigue. Join us every Monday to get our thoughts and subscribe to their YouTube channel, YouTube Primary Source. Now, with all of those announcements out of the way, we can get to today's installment. For purposes of good order, this podcast is composed of several sources associated with Ben Franklin's life, knit together to collect it all into one narrative on a cohesive theme. Today's episode is about botany. It's about the symmetry of nature, and it's about a gardener who changed the world. I sat down this week with a long-standing member of our junto. He originally reached out to me in season 1 through an email correspondence asking me a prolific question about botany. Since then, we've exchanged correspondences, and I'm delighted to have him on the show today. Now, a little bit about him. Dr. Menzmer authors the blog Pondering the Past, which you can follow on Instagram. He just received his doctorate from the University of Georgia at the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming the newly minted Dr. Menzmer. Dr. Menzmer, thank you so much for joining us on Let's Be Frank, and my hearty congratulations for, is it a defense of your thesis? Is this, or your dissertation?
Yes, yes. I'm a recently newly minted Dr. Menzmer. And a pleasure to talk with you, Dr. Frank.
Congratulations. Congratulations. We're so excited to talk to you today about the fascinating topic of botany in the 18th century, and specifically how it ties to the wider world, to science, and also the political spectrum of the American colonies and the American Revolution. So I wonder if we could begin by you telling us a little bit about the development of the study of botany in the 18th century.
Certainly. And I want to say it's a pleasure to chat with you from now make sure you're sitting down for this, the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Georgia.
I'm
So it is a
completely
privilege to
flattered.
talk with my namesake, with my college's namesake. So the study of botany in the 18th century was very much motivated by both medicine, of using herbs for medicinal purposes to help heal people, as well as trade to basically be able to make a profit, whether it's tobacco or other plants, and make a profit and a living. And so I would say kind of how botany developed in the 18th century was both for profit as well as for healing.
Incredible. And did that go on both sides of the colonies? What was it simultaneously that medicinal purpose in both England as well as in the colonies, or did we see differences in how botany was studied and utilized? In Great Britain, was it more ornamental versus in the colonies utilitarian, or was it cohesive and all in one? Was it one of the ways in which people connected?
I would say a little bit of both. I think it was a way where people connected. Many times there would be people such as Peter Collinson, I'm trying to think of some others, Carl Linnaeus. They would ask people or merchants or friend connections they had to go to America and collect plants because they were curious of what's here. You may recall the painter by the name of Mark Catesby in 1712 visited Williamsburg in Virginia, and then, well, in the 1720s went to visit the Carolinas, Florida, and Bahamas. And on that latter excursion, he made like a lot of watercolor paintings of animals and plants that people had never seen even a drawing of before. And that book that he published once he got back to Europe really excited people about what all the species were here in America. And so that it was both for interest. Certainly later on, there was interest in Europe to take American species and ornament them in their gardens for people of the gentry of society.
So botany was, in many respects, a way to cultivate an interest and investment in the New World. A person who had never set foot in America and would never step foot in America suddenly had an acquaintance in it through these drawings, through these cuttings, and through the careful study of America's unique plants.
Certainly, and I forget if it was Peter Collinson or perhaps one of his colleagues mentioned that while they had never been to America, they walked through America every day because they had so many of the trees and plants planted in their garden from America.
That sounds like something my dear friend Peter would say. He's very poetic like that. So you've mentioned several names. You've mentioned Peter Collinson. You've mentioned Carl Linnaeus. There is one American gardener who I think for this period stands out more than any other. You can still visit his gardens in Philadelphia to this day, and he, it could be argued, did more for the field of botany and establishing the identity of American natural science than any other philosopher or botanist at the time. That is, of course, John Bartram, and that's who we're here to talk about today. So I wonder, Dr. Menzmer, if you could tell us a little bit about who is John Bartram, and then we can delve into his contributions and what makes him so prolific and worthy of our curiosity.
Certainly, I absolutely agree. John Bartram is the one name that I think is more important in the development of American botany. In fact, he is called the father of American botany. So he was born in what we now call the United States of America in 1699. He was raised in the Quaker denomination. His grandparents actually immigrated to America from England due to some religious persecution for their beliefs. And they took William Penn up on his offer to come to Pennsylvania and have some more religious freedom than they had had in Europe. John Bartram had quite a bit of tragedy early on in his life. His mother passed away when he was just like 2 or 3 from childbirth with a younger sibling. His father passed away when his father William went to the Carolinas and was killed by Indians. And so he was raised quite a bit by his grandparents. When he was in 1723, when he was about 24, he married a woman by the name of Mary. She died about 3, 4 years later, leaving him with one son. But he married a woman by the name of Anne Mend Mendenhall when he was 30. And that was the marriage that lasted till the end of his life. He had inherited a estate, a farm from his uncle Isaac along the river. I don't know how to pronounce it. The
Schuylkill,
Shaquille.
or Schuylkill,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And was able to start life there.
Wonderful. So this man who faced a lot of early hardship arrived at a place where he had a farm. He had all the trappings of a normal life. He could have, at that point, settled down and done nothing more, and still would have had a good life. So, what got him involved and interested in botany? How did this farmer, after so much hardship with this new wife, settle in to suddenly become one of the most prolific figures of horticulture?
I have not specifically found what got him interested. I believe when you are outside, certainly with my experience of studying, being a botanist myself, you're studying outside and you just become curious about what's out there. And I think John Bartram, I would suspect, just had, being a farmer and being outside, just had an innate curiosity and wanted to learn more. But I have not found any particular source that said this was the story of how he got into it.
I see. I see. So is this farm the one that eventually blossoms to become his garden, or is that a separate property?
That is this one in the same property, yes.
I see. So what does this farm grow into? How does Bartram make his mark and pardon the turn of phrase, plant the seeds that would grow into his eventual position as royal botanist, was it?
Yes, His Majesty King George III is a royal botanist for the North American colonies. So I think it is a bit of happenstance, of a good fortune, because you mentioned your friend Peter Collinson was had a great interest in North American natural history. And in fact, I can find my note on it. Volunteered, I believe you had created a subscription library company, and he had volunteered to become the unpaid London agent. And in Collinson's interest for getting more plants of America and learning about them, he asked one of the members of that library company by the name of Joseph Brentonell, is there any man in the colonies that's has a hankering for plants and good collection and being able to make good written accounts? And Brentonell pointed Collinson to John Bartram. And so they started a correspondence in, I believe, the early 1730s, around 1733. And I really think it's the connection with Collinson was able to bring Bartram connections in Europe, but also Bartram was able to have an opportunity now to share the plants of the New World with those in the Old.
How did John Bartram's legacy pass not only to his family, but into the trappings of what would become the American Revolution?
To the American Revolution. Certainly with his family, I know his son went on to become a well-known botanist himself, and continued to have an impact later on in the 17 and early 1800s. With regards to the American Revolution, I would say more the American Revolution interrupted
Hmm,
botany
fascinating.
because of the transfer of plants from the colonies to the mother country, was but Collinson had first asked Bartram, "Hey, can you send me some plants?" And Bartram's like, "Sure." And Collinson's like, "Hey, I'm going to pay you by giving you a nice set of clothing. Well, that's how I'll pay you." And they do that. And then the next year, Collinson is like, can you send me more plants? But one of my friends wants some plants. Can you collect for him too?" And this was actually quite a bit challenging for Bartram because sometimes plants were close by and easy access. And sometimes he had to do trips of several days to several weeks, traverse miles to get the plants that Collinson wanted. And so Bartram and Collinson finally were like, "Hey, this is a business model. Let's start doing a subscription service where I will collect plants in the fall. It's all going to be the same plants. I'm going to label them, identify them, and then send them in what they termed Bartram's boxes to Collinson in England, and would separate out. Collinson would send each box to the respective owner. And Bartram received, I believe it was about 20 guineas per box to help reimburse him for his time and effort to send the boxes over. But first, with the War of Austrian Succession in 1740, where France was trying to disrupt um, transport of English goods from the colonies to the mother country. And then with the American Revolution, um, it meant that the safe travel of boxes from America to Europe was in danger. And so sometimes Bartram would send boxes to London, and sometimes Bartram would send addressed boxes to botanist friends in Paris. And the botanist friends in Paris would then send the boxes on to London. And so there was a decent chance that some of the boxes were going to get to their respective owners.
Fascinating. Were there some plants that were prized above others? What were some incredibly popular plants of the time that were native species of America?
Certainly. I know that there's some writings about the ginseng plant, were highly valued. I also remember reading that I forget this particular species, but some of the tree species that were unique in America were highly prized over in Europe gardens.
Fascinating. Now, for yourself, Dr. Menzmer,
Yes,
what came first, your love of history or your love of botany?
that is a question for the ages that my family and I are still trying to figure out. I have always enjoyed being outside and being able to share nature with others. And then um, in my schooling, I realized that the stories of people are fascinating. And so I've always thought that that was kind of interesting. They're really concurrent for me. And then when I realized about 3 or 4 years ago that there is a history of botany, that the history of people is also includes the history of studying plants and the transport of plants and the value of plants, kind of found my happy place. So I would really say that both kind of came about at the same time.
Fascinating. What are some books that you would recommend for people who are looking to marry their love of history and botany?
Certainly. I find it very interesting because one of the recent guests you had, Robert Weathers, talking about solar eclipse, had recommended a book by the name of Chasing Venus that you had mentioned was by Madame Andrea Wolf. And she has also written what I think are the best books about botany in American history. One is called Brother Gardeners, which really talks about John Bartram and Peter Carlson, as well as some of their friends. Then, while Bartram is not mentioned in it, Mrs. Wolf has wrote a sequel called Founding Gardeners, which talks about the American Revolution and how that happened through the perspective of plants. And so George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and you may have been acquainted with James Madison, how their value on plants really shaped the direction our fledgling country took. So I would really say those two books are really fantastic. If you're wanting a better view, closer look on John Bartram himself, there's an out of print book, but you can still gather it at used bookstores called The Life and Travels of John Bartram by Edmund and Dorothy Smith Berkeley. That is absolutely fantastic because they are both botanists by training and historians by training. And
Mm.
it is a fantastic read.
So can we look forward to your eventual mark on the field of historical botany?
I am planning to write papers about the history of botany in Georgia because there's so much done about the history of botany in Virginia, but very little on
Mm.
Georgia. So that is an area of professional interest for me.
No, we look forward to it. My last question is for you,
Yes,
my dear friend.
certainly.
Well, what is it about studying history that sets you on fire?
I love learning about stories of people. And I don't know about in your time period, but at least in mine, people are fascinated with learning where did they come from
Mm.
and identifying with those that came before it in the same lineage. And professionally, I think it is fascinating to learn about the botanists that went before me because when I know about who came before me, I feel like I'm in a path, in a lineage of this is this is where I came from professionally. For example, there is a species called partridgeberry that I find quite a bit in my work. Its scientific name is Mitchella repens. Well, Carl Linnaeus named it Mitchella repens after a botanist in Virginia by the name of John Mitchell. And so learning about John Mitchell, the history of botany helps inform, oh, that's not just some random plant. It was named by Carl Linnaeus after one of his friends. And I think those stories are fascinating to learn about whether it's the names of plants or how botanists have impacted, people have impacted the course of history. It's a story of people. And I think that's very interesting.
Mm. Dr. Menzmer, thank you so much for joining us today. If our listeners wanted to learn more from you and find you, is there a social media tag they might find you at?
Certainly. You can find me on Instagram at Pondering the Past.
Wonderful. Dr. Menzmer, congratulations again on the defense of your dissertation, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
In 1787, through the stifling heat of summer, the Constitutional Convention convened to debate the future of the continent of North America in the fledgling government which was on the precipice of ruin. During one recess, the delegates to the convention decided to take for all intents, a field trip to see the famed gardens of John Bartram. Walking amongst his trees and plants, they spoke of their hopes for America. They found unity in a time where compromise seemed impossible. Now, was that singular trip responsible for the miracle of 1787? No, certainly not. But it does provide example of what happens when we take a pause in our daily life and grow taller walking amongst the trees. And therein, my dear friends, is the lesson for today's installment. When life grows stressful, when solutions seem unclear, when we find ourselves backed into a corner with no way forward, chances are we might find better clarity by stepping outside, smelling the flowers, finding shade of a tree, and in doing so, in walking amongst giants and taking part in life reborn, we better find our place in the world. That's all for today's installment. Would that we had more hours in the day, but as always, we have nothing but time between us. Resource materials and images from this week's episode can be found in the journal of bfranklinlive.com. If you like the show, subscribe and stay up to date with all the latest gossip, and do me the kindness of leaving a review. And, dear listener, spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your horse, I don't care. Let's make our intellectual junto grow. And now, our time together must come to an end. Fare thee well, and always remember, when you are good to others, you are best to yourselves. Until we meet again, I remain your humble and obedient servant, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, Printer. Stay curious, my friends.